Have you ever heard a sound in the dead of night that forced you out of bed, only to find your entire reality shattered? For Gwendolen, a despised outcast, one knock changed everything. She opened her door to a blizzard, and the Alpha King's massive wolves flooded her yard. The winter of 1244 struck the isolated mountain village of Oakhaven with unprecedented ferocity. Snow drifts piled high against the thatched roofs, and the relentless howling of the wind through the Ethelgard Mountains sounded like the wails of departed spirits. On the absolute furthest edge of the settlement, pushed against the dark tree line of the Whispering Woods, sat a humble, weather-beaten cabin. This was the home of Gwendolen Hayes. Gwendolen was an anomaly, an outcast in a society built upon rigid hierarchies and strict adherence to pack conformity. In the world of wolves, to be an omega was to be relegated to the lowest rung of the social ladder, a caregiver, a submissive, someone meant to serve the greater good of the pack without question. But Gwendolen carried a secondary mark that made her an object of deep superstition and fear among the villagers. She was an albino. Her hair fell in cascades of pure, unblemished white. Her skin was as pale as the snow piling up outside her window, and her eyes held a striking, luminous shade of pale violet. In the medieval minds of the Oakhaven pack, led by the deeply prejudiced Alderman Regis, anything so starkly different was considered an ill omen. Her father, Arthur Hayes, had been a respected warrior in his time, which was the only reason Gwendolen had not been cast out into the wilderness upon her first transformation. But Arthur had passed away 3 winters ago, succumbing to a severe chest fever. Since then, Gwendolen lived a solitary existence, surviving on the meager rations she could trade for her exceptional skills in herbalism and weaving. The villagers only approached her door when illness struck and the local healer's remedies failed, and even then they took the poultices with averted eyes and whispered prayers to the moon goddess to ward off her supposed curse. On the night of the winter solstice, the storm outside reached a terrifying crescendo. Gwendolen sat by her stone hearth, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her slender shoulders. The fire was dying down to glowing embers, casting long dancing shadows across the rough-hewn wooden walls of her home. She was attempting to mend a torn tunic by the dim light of a single tallow candle, her nimble fingers working the bone needle through the coarse fabric. The cold was seeping through the cracks in the mud-chinked walls, promising a bitter, freezing night. Then she heard it. It was not the wind. It was not the snapping of a frozen branch in the nearby woods. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath her floorboards, a deep, resonant, rhythmic thud. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of heavy-armored footfalls marching in absolute unison, and underneath that heavy rhythm was a low collective growl that made the hair on Gwendolen's arms stand straight up. Her inner wolf, usually quiet and submissive, whined in sudden, uncharacteristic panic. Gwendolen froze the needle, slipping from her fingers to the floor. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing ominously through the desolate silence of her isolated property. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the frosted panes of her front window, blocking out the pale moonlight. Then came a heavy, authoritative knock on her thick oak door. The wood groaned under the force of the strike. For a long moment, Gwendolen could not breathe. Bandits! No bandits did not march with such disciplined precision. Rogue wolves. Rogues were chaotic wild creatures driven by madness, incapable of this synchronized, terrifying approach. The knock came again, harder this time. Dust fell from the rafters. Swallowing her terror, Gwendolen stood. She picked up the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth, a pitiful weapon against a fully grown werewolf, but the only defense she possessed. Her bare feet made no sound against the wooden floorboards as she approached the door. Her hand trembled violently as she reached for the heavy iron latch. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But in the world of wolves, ignoring a summons at your door was a sign of weakness that often invited violence. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Gwendolen lifted the latch and pulled the heavy oak door inward. The gust of freezing wind that rushed into the cabin nearly knocked her backward, extinguishing her single candle instantly. But it was not the cold that made Gwendolen drop the iron poker with a clatter. It was the sight that greeted her in the darkness. Her front yard, usually an empty expanse of snow leading up to the forest edge, was completely filled. Hundreds of massive, dire wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the blizzard. These were not the common brown and grey wolves of Oakhaven. These beasts were colossal, their coats a uniform, intimidating black. Even more shocking, they were outfitted in custom-forged iron plating chest pieces and spiked collars that gleamed dully in the moonlight. And emblazoned upon the armor of the largest wolves, standing at the front, was a crest Gwendolen had only ever seen in faded history books, a roaring wolf's head crowned with 3 jagged peaks, the royal crest. Gwendolen's breath hitched in her throat, her knees threatened to give way. Standing in her humble snow-covered yard were the elite royal guards of the Alpha King. The stories said they only rode out for war, or to execute those guilty of the highest treason. As the massive wolves stared at her with glowing amber eyes, an oppressive silence settled over the yard, broken only by the howling wind and the heavy synchronized breathing of the beasts. Gwendolen stood paralyzed in her doorway, a solitary white figure against the dark, terrifying might of the royal army. The sea of monstrous black wolves parted with eerie, disciplined silence. Down the center of the path they created walked a man who seemed to command the very storm around him. He did not wear the heavy pelts or shivering cloaks common to the mountain folk. Instead, he was clad in dark, tailored leather and chainmail that fit his broad, muscular frame perfectly. A thick, fur-lined cape billowed behind him, untouched by the swirling snow. This was King Caelan Croft. Gwendolen had heard whispers of the Alpha King from traveling merchants. They spoke of a ruler whose authority was absolute, whose physical strength was unmatched across the 5 territories, and whose temper was as volatile as a summer thunderstorm. As he stepped into the light spilling from her doorway, Gwendolen finally saw his face. He possessed sharp, aristocratic features, a strong jaw heavily shadowed with dark stubble, and eyes the color of a tempestuous, bruised sky. His gaze locked onto Gwendolen, and the sheer intensity of his dominant aura forced her to lower her eyes and expose her neck, a purely instinctual omega reaction to a king. Gwendolen Hayes. King Caelan's voice resonated through the clearing. It was a deep, gravelly baritone that cut effortlessly through the howling wind. It was not a question. It was a statement of absolute certainty. Before Gwendolen could force her voice to work, the crunch of hasty footsteps echoed from the path leading back to the village center. A chaotic jumble of torches pierced the darkness. Alderman Regis, breathless and red-faced, arrived with a dozen village guards trailing nervously behind him. The local guards looked utterly pathetic next to the imposing royal army. "My king," Alderman Regis gasped, dropping to one knee in the snow. We did not know you were gracing our humble Oakhaven with your presence. Had we known, a proper feast would have been prepared." Regis shot a venomous glare toward Gwendolen. "I apologize profoundly that your royal procession had to stop at this cursed dwelling. The girl is an Omega and an albino anomaly. She is a blight upon our pack. Please allow us to escort you to the village hall where it is warm and clean." Gwendolen shrank back against the doorframe, humiliated and terrified. Regis was trying to offer her up to distance the village from her, in case the king had come looking for someone to punish. King Caelan did not even look at the alderman. His storm-grey eyes remained fixed on Gwendolen's trembling form. "Silence, Regis," Caelan commanded. The words were spoken softly, yet they carried a terrifying weight that made the alderman snap his jaw shut instantly. Kaelin stepped closer to the porch, bridging the gap until he was mere feet from Gwendolen. She could feel the immense heat radiating from his large frame, pushing back the winter chill. "I have not come for a feast," Kaelin said, his gaze tracing the pure white strands of hair that blew across her pale face. "And I haven't come to your village hall. I have come exactly where I intended." Regis, unable to completely stifle his prejudice, spoke up again, his voice trembling. "But sire, she is worthless. She carries the white curse. If there is treason or deceit you investigate, she is surely to blame. We can detain her for you. Faster than Gwendolen's eyes could track, King." Kaelin pivoted. The sudden release of his alpha pheromones was so overpowering that several of the village guards collapsed to their knees in the snow, gasping for air. Even Regis whimpered, pressing his face into the freezing dirt. "You speak of things you do not comprehend, Alderman." Kaelin's voice dropped to a lethal growl. "You look at this female and see a curse because your minds are small and trapped in the mud of ancient ignorance. You see an anomaly." Kaelin turned back to Gwendolen, the harshness in his expression softening by a fraction. "I see a lunar guide." Gwendolen gasped, her violet eyes widening in shock. A what?" she whispered. "A lunar guide," Kaelin repeated, stepping onto the wooden planks of her porch. Generations ago, before the territories were unified, the royal seers were not chosen. They were born. They carried the mark of the moon, goddess hair, as white as winter eyes, like the twilight sky. They possessed the unique ability to see the true nature of a wolf's soul, to track the invisible strings of magic that bind our kind to the earth. The line was thought extinct. Gwendolen shook her head frantically, pressing her back against the door. "No, my king. You are mistaken. I am just Gwendolen. My father was Arthur Hayes, a simple warrior. My mother died when I was born. I have no magic. I weave baskets and mix herbs for coughs." "Your father hid you well," Kaelin stated, glancing around the dilapidated cabin. He knew that if the rival factions discovered a true lunar guide existed, you would be hunted down and used as a weapon. He sacrificed his place in the capital to live in this frozen wasteland, to keep you safe. The revelation hit Gwendolen with the force of a physical blow. Her entire life, the isolation, the whispered insults, the deep loneliness had all been a carefully constructed shield forged by her father's love. "Why? Why are you here now?" Gwendolen asked, her voice trembling. Kaelin's expression hardened a shadow of profound exhaustion, briefly crossing his regal features. "Because the realm is fracturing. A rogue faction, led by a warlord named Gareth, has stolen the Sunstone relic from the royal vaults. Gareth masks his scent and his tracks with dark ancient sorcery. My finest trackers are blind to him. He was last seen fleeing through the jagged passes of the Ethelgard Mountains." Kaelin reached out his large, calloused hand, gently hovering near Gwendolen's cheek, before dropping back to his side. "The Royal Archives speak of one way to pierce Gareth's magical veil. I need a lunar guide. I need you, Gwendolen." Before she could process the magnitude of his request, Kaelin turned to face the trembling alderman and the terrified villagers. "Hear me, Oakhaven," King Kaelin's voice boomed. "This yard, this cabin is now under the direct protection of the crown. I am commandeering this territory as my temporary command post. Any wolf who speaks an ill word against Gwendolen Hayes, any wolf who looks upon her with disrespect, will answer directly to my claws." He turned back to Gwendolen, stepping past her through the doorway and into the freezing, dimly lit cabin. "Close the door, Gwendolen," the Alpha King commanded, softly looking at the dying embers in her hearth. "We have much to discuss, and a long hunt ahead of us." Gwendolen pushed the heavy oak door shut against the howling tempest, the iron latch dropping into place with a definitive clank. The sudden quiet inside the cabin was startling, broken only by the whistling drafts and the heavy measured breathing of the Alpha King. Caelan Croft seemed to take up the entirety of her small living space. His broad shoulders brushed against the hanging bundles of dried lavender and rosemary, and his commanding presence made the familiar walls feel incredibly small. He moved toward the hearth, pulling off his thick leather gauntlets. With practiced efficiency, he tossed a few fresh logs onto the dying embers, and stoked them until a warm, golden fire crackled to life. Gwendolen stood near the door, her arms wrapped defensively around her torso. She was still struggling to process the impossible words he had spoken on her porch. A lunar guide. It sounded like something out of a minstrel's fireside tale, not a reality for an Omega who spent her days mending torn tunics and avoiding the cruel glares of the village women. "Sit, Gwendolen," Caelan instructed, gently gesturing to the worn wooden chair beside the fire. It was not a harsh command, but it carried an undeniable authority. She moved cautiously, taking a seat, while Caelan remained standing his back to the flames. The firelight danced across his rugged features, highlighting a jagged old scar that ran along his jawline, a testament to battles fought to secure his crown. "You must think I am mad, or perhaps cruelly jesting with you." Caelan began, his tempestuous grey eyes softening as he looked down at her. "But I assure you, everything I have said is the absolute truth. Your father Arthur was not merely a warrior. He was Lord Arthur Pendleton, the commander of the Royal Vanguard under my father's reign." Gwendolen gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Pendleton. But that is a noble house. A house of the High Court. Why would he abandon such a life to raise me in this frozen squalor?" "Because of what you are," Caelan answered, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a heavy note of sorrow. "When you were born, the royal midwives saw the signs immediately. The pure white hair, the violet eyes. You were the first lunar guide, born in over 3 centuries. In an era of peace, you would have been revered. But the realm was deeply unstable. Rival factions greedy for power would have stopped at nothing to claim you. A lunar guide can see the hidden pathways of the Earth track ancient magic and pierce any veil of deception. You would have been chained to a warlord's throne, used as a human compass for conquest." Tears pricked the corners of Gwendolen's eyes. The father, she remembered, was a quiet, stern man who demanded she hide her hair beneath heavy hoods and keep her eyes downcast. She had always thought he was ashamed of her. Now she realized every harsh scolding, every forced isolation was an act of profound, desperate love. He had traded his honor, his wealth, and his comfort to ensure she remained free, even if that freedom meant living as an outcast in Oakhaven. Gareth Harrington. Caelan continued pacing a few steps across the worn floorboards. He is a warlord from the Western Reaches. He has stolen the Sunstone Relic, an artifact of immense, volatile energy. With it, he plans to fracture the unified territories and plunge the realm into endless war. He employs dark, forgotten sorcery to mask his scent and render his footprints invisible to my finest trackers. We followed his fading trail to the Athelgard Mountains, but the blizzard coupled with his magic has blinded us. If he crosses the jagged peaks and reaches the western strongholds, the realm will fall. Caelan stopped and knelt before her, bringing himself to her eye level. The proximity was intoxicating. Gwendolen could smell his scent, a crisp, overwhelming blend of cedar wood, winter frost, and pure alpha dominance. It made her inner wolf tremble not with fear, but with an ancient, instinctual reverence. "I cannot see him." "Gwendolen," Caelan said softly, his gaze locked onto her luminous violet eyes. "But you can. The magic he uses leaves a stain on the natural world, a disruption that only a guide can perceive. I need you to awaken." "I do not know how," she whispered, her voice trembling. I have never felt any magic within me. I am just empty." "You are not empty," Kaelin corrected, reaching out. His large, warm hands gently cupped her pale cheeks. A sudden jolt of electricity sparked, where his skin met hers, a startling warmth that chased away the lingering winter chill in her bones. "You have spent your entire life suppressing your true nature to survive in a pack that despised what they could not understand. You must let the walls down. Let the Omega submission fade. Feel the pull of the moon." He closed his eyes, and Gwendolyn felt a surge of his alpha energy washing over her, not to dominate, but to shield and support. He was offering his strength as an anchor. "Close your eyes, Gwendolyn," he murmured. She obeyed. "Reach past the fear." He guided her, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. "Reach past the years of isolation. Find the quiet place in your mind. Listen to the hum of the earth beneath the floorboards." At first there was only darkness and the sound of the wind outside, but as Gwendolyn focused on Kaelin's steady heartbeat and the immense warmth radiating from him, something deep within her chest began to stir. It felt like a dormant ember suddenly catching a draught of oxygen. A strange, resonant humming filled her ears, distinct from the howling storm. "Open your eyes," an ancient instinct whispered in her mind. Gwendolyn opened her eyes. She gasped, stumbling backward out of the chair, Kaelin's hands falling away. The world had fundamentally changed. The dim fire-lit cabin was now overlaid with a breathtaking tapestry of glowing, ethereal light. She could see shimmering silver currents drifting through the air, pulsing in time with the earth. She looked at Kaelin and saw a magnificent, blazing aura of gold and deep azure surrounding him, the physical manifestation of his royal authority and pure, unyielding spirit. And then she looked toward the window. Beyond the frosted glass, cutting through the swirling snow and the natural silver currents of the forest, was a thick, jagged trail of sickly necrotic green. It pulsed with a foul, unnatural rhythm, winding its way up the treacherous slopes of the Ethelgard Mountains. It was a scar upon the earth, a trail of dark sorcery. "You see it?" Kaelin stated, watching the profound change in her expression, the way her violet eyes now glowed with an inner starlight luminescence. "Yes." Gwendolyn breathed awe and terror mixing in her voice. "It is a twisted path. It leads up toward the ruins of Dunrobin Keep." Kaelin stood, his expression hardening into that of a king marching to war. He reached for his heavy leather gauntlets. "Then bundle up my guide. We ride for the peaks." The ascent into the Ethelgard Mountains was a grueling test of sheer endurance. King Kaelin shifted into his wolf form, a beast of nightmare proportions, his coat as black as the midnight sky, armored in heavy spiked iron. He insisted Gwendolyn ride upon his broad back, shielding her from the absolute worst of the freezing wind with his immense body heat. Behind them marched 200 elite royal guards, moving with disciplined silence through the knee-deep snow. Gwendolyn clung to Kaelin's thick fur, her violet eyes wide open to this newly unveiled reality. The world was a breathtaking canvas of glowing threads. The sickly green trail of Gareth's magic was blindingly obvious to her, now a putrid ribbon winding through the treacherous icy crags. She guided the king with gentle nudges of her knees and whispered directions, steering the massive royal army away from hidden crevasses and magically concealed dead ends that Gareth had intentionally laid to trap his pursuers. As they neared the jagged summit, the crumbling stone towers of Dunrobin Keep loomed out of the swirling blizzard like the skeletal fingers of a forgotten giant. The dark green trail thickened considerably, pooling directly around the heavy iron gates of the ruined fortress. Kaelin shifted back to his human form, quickly signaling his commanders to fan out and encircle the icy ruins. He drew a massive broadsword from his back, the polished steel humming with its own latent energy. He looked at Gwendolen, who was trembling slightly from the sheer proximity of the corrupted magic. "Stay behind me," Kalen ordered, his voice a low, protective rumble. They breached the courtyard, the royal guards pouring through the crumbling walls like a tide of shadows. In the absolute center of the ruined keep stood Lord Gareth Harrington. He was a gaunt, menacing figure, wrapped in tattered furs, his bony hands clutching a leather satchel that pulsed with a blinding golden light, the Sunstone relic. Surrounding him were a dozen rogue mercenaries, their eyes clouded with the dark sorcery Gareth was actively using to control their minds. "King Kalen," Gareth shouted over the howling wind, a manic grin stretching across his hollowed face. "I see you finally found a way through the storm, but you are far too late. The relic is primed. Once I shatter its core, the resulting shockwave will level the capital and leave the unified territories utterly defenseless. Surrender the stone, Harrington!" Kalen roared, his heavy sword raised high. "Your madness ends tonight in this frozen wasteland." "Wah!" Gareth laughed, a harsh, grating sound that chilled the air further. "Madness? Oh, my king, you know absolutely nothing of deceit. How do you think I knew your exact patrol routes? How do you think I knew you were wasting your time searching the lowlands while I slipped into the mountains?" Gareth pointed a long, bony finger directly at Gwendolen. "I had eyes inside Oakhaven, your precious, supposedly loyal Alderman Regis. For a few bags of silver and the promise of a seat on my new High Council, he gladly detailed your every movement. He even offered to drown the albino anomaly in the river if she proved to be a nuisance, completely unaware of what she truly was." Gwendolen felt a cold sickness pool in her stomach. The alderman's cruelty was not just born of prejudice, it was calculated malice. He had sold out his king and his own pack. "Regis will face the executioner's block," Kalen snarled, his eyes flashing with lethal fury. "And you will not leave this courtyard." Gareth raised his hands, and the dark, necrotic magic flared. The corrupted rogues surged forward with unnatural speed, clashing violently with the royal guard. The sound of ringing steel and heavy bone-jarring impacts echoed off the ancient stone walls. Gareth began to chant, his hands glowing with foul energy as he reached for the clasp of the satchel, holding the Sunstone. "He is trying to crack the relic's seal," Gwendolen shouted over the chaos. Her lunar guide vision showed her the intricate dark locks Gareth was weaving around the pure gold energy of the stone. Kalen could not reach him in time, bogged down by 3 massive rogue wolves. Gwendolen realized she lacked physical strength, but as she stared at the dark magic swirling around Gareth, she saw the threads. What could be woven could be unraveled. Running purely on ancient instincts, Gwendolen stepped out from behind the guards. She raised her hands toward Gareth, her violet eyes flaring with blinding intensity. She focused on the sickly green threads of his spell, imagining her own energy, pure and silver, reaching out like celestial shears. Snap! She severed the central thread of his incantation. A resounding ethereal crack echoed through the courtyard. Gareth's chanting choked off. The dark magic shattered like fragile glass, dissolving into harmless black smoke. The sudden backlash threw Gareth backward, slamming him brutally into the stone wall. The satchel tumbled from his grasp. The rogues, freed from mind control, faltered and were quickly subdued. Kalen crossed the courtyard, pinning Gareth's chest to the ground, with his heavy boot, his broadsword resting against the warlord's throat. The battle was over. The king secured the Sunstone, handed it to his commander, and ordered Gareth bound in iron chains. Then he gathered the exhausted, magnificent Gwendolen gently into his massive arms. 2 days later, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant light over Oakhaven. The royal army stood in disciplined ranks in the village square. In the center, Alderman Regis knelt in the mud, weeping as guards stripped him of his title. His deceit had been laid bare, his fate sealed. The villagers watched in stunned silence, their gaze fixed on the village hall steps. King Caelan Croft stood tall. Beside him was Gwendolen, wearing a stunning midnight blue velvet gown that contrasted perfectly with her pure white hair. She looked every inch a noble sovereign. For years you looked upon this woman and saw a curse, Caelan's voice echoed. But Gwendolen Hayes is the savior of the realm. She is the last lunar guide. In front of the entire village, the Alpha King dropped to one knee. The collective gasp was deafening. He took her small hand. Gwendolen, you guided me through the darkest storm. Now I ask you to guide me through the rest of my life. Return with me to the capital as my queen. Gwendolen looked at the villagers who had scorned her, now bowing in deep reverence. She squeezed Caelan's hand, a radiant smile breaking across her face. I will, she whispered. As the Alpha King pulled his fated mate into a passionate embrace, the massive black wolves of the royal guard let out a synchronized, thunderous howl, welcoming their new queen. Did Gwendolen's journey from a despised outcast to a powerful queen leave you breathless? The world of the Alpha King is filled with even more secrets, ancient magic and epic romance waiting to be uncovered. If you loved this medieval werewolf tale, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories. Let us know in the comments what you want to see next. See you soon.